Oh, holy smokes, ladies and germs. I didn't see you there. We're back today with another series of debates that we're doing with one of our dear friends who's out there on the front lines. He's a medic fighting in Ukraine, helping people not die. Matt, what's going on, brother?
Not much. I did want to actually issue a couple of corrections on myself for last week because, yeah, I do like to hold myself accountable, right? I'm not ever going to just insist I'm always right. No, the facts are wrong. So last week I wrongfully said that NATO prior to Ukraine prior to 2014 was never on the table for NATO. It turns out that there was actually some attempts to get them NATO candidacy status. They did not get particularly far in the application process between 2010 and 2014, and then, between when they started in 2014, especially because Yanukovych pulled them out of it. But I was wrong about that. And then the other thing I wanted to address was the structure of NATO itself, because I actually read the comments on YouTube, and someone mentioned that NATO involvement in Libya as a counter against NATO being a defensive alliance. And my response to that is that NATO, the alliance, and NATO members are not the same thing. Individually, members of NATO can engage in overseas military action, but that does not mean that NATO as a whole has agreed to that or endorsed it. So, for example, with Libya, the United States and the United Kingdom were involved there, but you'd be hard-pressed to find, say, Lithuanian or Estonian troops involved in a conflict like that because they had no obligation to be. NATO Article 5 was at no point invoked. And so even though NATO countries were involved, it was not actually a NATO operation. Article 5 has only been invoked once, and that was actually following 9/11 that led to the NATO intervention in Afghanistan. But beyond that, direct participation in conflicts by NATO members does not necessarily itself mean that it is a NATO action. And there are times when various NATO members have actually been opposed in conflicts. For example, Turkey and the United States during the Syrian civil war and the fight against ISIS is a really clear example of that, where you have the United States directly providing aid to the Kurds, not just in the form of support, but beyond that, even in terms of arms and direct air support. And then you have Turkey on the other side of that, where they are bombing the same people. So when I say that NATO is purely a defensive alliance, I mean that NATO members can only be compelled to action within NATO when a NATO member is attacked and then invokes Article 5.
Well,
so that's
a great point. And for me, it's like potato. If you're a Western guy and you find yourself in Kuwait, for instance, which the NATO definitely went to Kuwait during Desert Storm and acted on behalf of Western interests. For me, it's like, well, you're still kind of in the pot. But you know what? We can come back another time and I can do more research on Article 5 and all this stuff. I don't have a depth of argument. But I just want to say Mike is here from Turn Leftist. What's going on,
Hey, how's
Mike?
it going, guys? I appreciate the intro, Matt. I actually really appreciate you doing like the self-crit and like self-accountability of coming in hot with corrections right off the bat. I could definitely appreciate that. And I just want to commend it, and like just in the spirit of good faith. I will say, like, my take on that when I hear you mention like Afghanistan, even, it's like, I feel like now, 20 years on, people wouldn't hesitate to say that 9/11, if not directly provoked by the U.S., there are some conspiracy theorists who think that it was like an inside job, like Bush himself did it or something. But I think it's even more of just a mainstream common sense take to say that it was the result of U.S. meddling in the Middle East. It was the reaction, the terrorist, just like most of the terrorism that has come the U.S.'s way has been the result of its meddling in affairs that were not its own, and that were spurned by profit, like incited by trying to bring in imperial super profits. And so that kind of goes to my point of like saying the same thing. It's like, we're probably not going to find any smoking gun. Like, I'd be hard pressed to find like a document that says, hey, we're going to intentionally provoke Putin to invade Ukraine. But there are plenty of documents, and even the CIA heads themselves and people who were, like I said, William Burns last week, the previous ambassador to Russia, saying like, hey, look, this is the red line that we keep crossing. And if we keep doing this, it's most likely going to provoke a reaction from Russia. And now that's also convenient for the U.S., for NATO allied states, because it lets them invoke Article 5. It lets them do the thing that makes it look like they were just these bumbling pawns that got attacked for no good reason and they're trying to protect freedom. It's like, if we understand the history of the U.S. and its imperialist ventures, it's like we know that this is like a typical playbook for them. And so it's like I'm more interested in like your general opinion. Like I got towards the end last week asking you some general questions. Like, do you think that NATO or European powers are generally a force for good in the world, or that like the colonialism that they've done over even the last century was like generally good for the people that they did it for, as far as like the development that it brought them, even if it was done in like a violent way at first?
I mean, getting on that, that's actually going to be a really good segue in a second. But what I will say is that I don't, broadly speaking, believe that Western powers engaging in overseas military adventures has, generally speaking, had a positive outcome. And
Thank God you
oftentimes
said that.
it's not
Yeah, I mean,
something
we can
I
find some common
support.
ground, which I like.
Yeah. My contention is not that what these people do is ideal or should be shielded from criticism. My thought process is more that the nature of the world we live in is that there will always be countries that are capable of exercising military force overseas. And these countries will also, when they have this ability, seek to exercise that force to further their own interests. And ultimately, I really see the Western hegemony as a lesser evil. I don't like it, but I just, at least based off of the years I've spent researching geopolitics and global conflict, come to the conclusion that if the West does not occupy its own hegemony and they were to pull back, it doesn't mean that we would enter a post-hegemony, more fractionalized world where the smaller states of the world have more sovereignty. There would simply be another entity that would step in to fill the gap, like Russia or China. And I personally believe that the end result of that would be something much, much, much worse.
Well, in the case of the Arab Spring, most of those countries ended up with less than before. Like we thought that we were doing something good by putting Gaddafi in or taking Gaddafi out, but essentially it's been just a big chaotic nightmare since that. And I did want to look at the top. I wanted to start by saying push back on what you said last time, which was that the what happened in Guatemala, the effects of it were short-lived and didn't. This is disingenuous in a lot of ways. And I just have to say, like,
when I said short-lived, what I meant by that was not that the consequences did not last for a long time, because they absolutely did. The consequences of these actions are still being experienced today. What I meant was that the operational goals and benefits of what the CIA and the United States government and mostly the United Fruit Company were looking to extract from this did not so much go according to plan, and the real end result was just the destruction of what Guatemala had previously been as a functional state and a prolonged period of instability that arguably lasts to this day, where a destabilized Guatemala has provided a role in allowing drug cartels to move things. It has created its own problems in the area. And functionally, my understanding is that Chiquita Banana's interests, while temporarily furthered there, did not really stick around forever either. And they now ended up with just an incredibly poor reputation. And they actually just lost a big lawsuit over all this. And I believe they're about to lose billions of dollars. So,
but that's a fraction of the profits that they've collected in the time that they've been doing business there, and then they're going to continue to do business. It's like they're not getting folded up. They're not having their businesses shut down and their executives arrested. No one's really being held accountable. They're sacrificing a fraction of their profits, and it's the cost of doing business for them. So that is actually a huge success, just like destabilizing Guatemala so that they can continue to do what they want, but still take profits. Like a destabilized country is actually very profitable for the West and for the three-letter intelligence agencies, just like having drug cartels is. If you ever know anything about the history of the Operation Gladio and all the CIA operations since, Not Southern Marxist on Twitter has been doing tons of threads about this shit all this week. If anybody wants to go check it out, you can see it right on his Twitter page, like with sources and everything. But I wanted to go back to your point earlier. Like when you say that, like, you don't think a multipolar world would lead to simply a power vacuum and the U.S. not taking center stage anymore, and that it would just be replaced immediately by China or Russia. It's like, that doesn't, first of all, I'm not scared by that. Like, I don't think that there's any kind of case that you can make that isn't based on xenophobia or Russophobia to say that that's going to be a worse outcome than the U.S. And it also doesn't jive with even people who are apologetic to Ukraine or U.S. imperialism as a regrettable but still better force in the world. It doesn't make any sense. Like, how can you, on one hand, say that Russia has this incompetent army and they're going to use to all of Europe united and the U.S., but then also think that they're going to somehow be competent enough to take over the entire world as soon as the U.S. starts taking a backseat? Like, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Well, that's not really what I'm getting at. Well, so
I just want to make one last point before I hand it back to you, Matt, and that is, when I say this, even in leftist circles, a lot of people tell me that I should be like supporting some kind of international working class movement rather than supporting like BRICS or anti-imperialist countries or, Russia, Iran, like countries that aren't even nominally socialist or leftist, but still fight the U.S. in any material way. And it's like, I support them because they are doing more than any international worker struggle. And not only that, but that worker struggle, if it exists, would have a much better shot at doing something if it didn't have the U.S. and the CIA around to assassinate all its leaders and sell drugs everywhere so that they could fund their operations to fight that socialist workers' movement. But I'll hand it back to you, Matt.
Yeah, so that's an excellent thing to touch on. First of all, the Russian military is in some ways incompetent, right? And I don't believe that even on the Russian military's best day, with as things currently stand, it could do anything particularly impressive in a direct conflict with NATO. What I am suggesting, though, is relative to most other militaries on the planet, aside from China, if, let's say, NATO were to collapse overnight, the United States just ceases to exist one day, NATO collapses, Russia would have enough resources and people that they would be able to exert an overwhelming amount of geopolitical power. But beyond that, I actually wanted to touch on the concept of anti-imperialist countries, because I personally do not believe that Russia or China can be construed as anti-imperialist. I'm personally of the mind that they are absolutely pro-imperialist. They're just in support of their own imperialism and opposed to other people's. And I want to focus on Russia today. I could go in on China, but China is not really the current country that I worry about the most in my day-to-day life.
No shit.
Obviously.
Yeah. So once again, we're going to have to go back a little bit to the Soviet Union. I promise this is not going to be a long digression, but it's really important for the context of Russian foreign policy today. And the reason for that is that in the early days of the Soviet Union, when it was structured, Lenin and later Stalin made certain very specific decisions with the intention of making it hard for the Soviet Union to ever break up. Specifically, they would find excuses in a lot of the outer Soviet republics, and even some places further in, to deport large amounts of people elsewhere, be that to Siberia or Western and Central Asia, and then they would move in Russians, like Slavic Russians from Western Russia. You can see them do this in places like Crimea, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and they did not do this on a small scale. Like, I believe Estonia had something like well over 50,000 people deported after World War II, mostly to Siberia. And this was a constant all over the Soviet Union, where they would either kill or deport large numbers of indigenous people, and then they would bring in their own people to replace them. The second part of this process of, I guess you could call it Russification, is that Russian was the official language of the Soviet Union. It was heavily standardized, and it was taught across the Soviet Union. It was not optional, and you had to speak Russian if you wanted to go anywhere in Soviet society, especially if you wanted to go from one of the Soviet republics actually to work in Russia, specifically around Moscow and St. Petersburg, which really were in many ways the center of the Soviet universe. And so this had some serious consequences for culture too, because essentially Russian culture became Soviet culture, because everything that was culturally distributed in the Soviet Union would end up oftentimes being in Russian. And there was a huge opposition to even like distributing books or making films in languages that were not Russian. And then the last thing that Russia did was they actually moved the physical borders of the republics that they absorbed specifically to cause problems. A really good example of where one place they did this was Ukraine, where they took some things that had previously been considered in Russia's borders and added them to the Ukrainian SSR. Another really good example of where they caused problems doing this was actually with Armenia, specifically when they took the Nagorno-Karabakh area, which had historically been part of Greater Armenia. The population was like 93% or something like that, ethnic Armenian during the first census, and they districted it to Azerbaijan. It was an independent oblast, so it was still a little bit separate, but the idea was that they specifically redrew these borders because they knew that if the Soviet Union ever broke up, it would cause serious problems, and it did in Nagorno-Karabakh as the Soviet Union started to fall apart. Now, where this becomes relevant to Russian foreign policy today is Russia's main pretext for invading a country now is they are persecuting ethnic Russian speakers. So, for example, the reason they originally got mad, the first time they actually did this was with Moldova just after the Soviet Union collapsed, and that was the excuse for splitting off what is now called Pridnestrovye or Transnistria. Even though Moldova was originally part of Romania and no one in Moldova spoke Russian before the USSR split it off from Romania and changed the language that was officially spoken in the country to Russian. And that was like the first time they did it, but in Ukraine, you actually see the beginnings of Russia starting to get annoyed with Ukraine was when Ukraine changed the official language to Ukrainian. And they were upset about this and said that this was persecution of ethnic Russian speakers in eastern Ukraine. And this was one of their main justifications for starting the fake separatist movement in Donetsk and Luhansk. And their initial pretext for the invasion in 2022, they said they were going in to defend ethnic Russian speakers. And more recently, they've actually been making similar gestures towards Estonia, because Estonia recently set in a new law saying that if you wanted to become naturalized as an Estonian citizen, you needed to be able to speak Estonian. They were very clear that like everything in Estonia in terms of like business and government paperwork now has to be done in Estonian. And I think this was last year, and Russia was very, very upset by this and started saying, oh, this is persecution of ethnic Russian speakers. And so the policy decisions made during the inception and history of the Soviet Union have directly been used to give Russia pretext to violate the sovereignty of their neighbors. And that's my thoughts on that.
So
I
was
like
the Ukrainian government not bombing Donetsk and Luhansk since 2014, or?
Well, the reason there was a military conflict there is that Russia didn't just send soldiers into Crimea. They also sent soldiers into Donetsk and Luhansk. They had agents planted ahead of time, and they basically faked it until they made it with a full-on insurgency and separatist movement that obviously, as any government would react when you have what amounts to armed terrorist groups backed by a foreign state begin attempting to seize territory and declare themselves sovereign, they went to go and suppress that. I mean,
Russia was doing like literally a reverse Gladio in Ukraine.
Yeah,
They're setting up like stay behind units and influencing things.
They had a lot more of their guys on the ground. Actually, there was some pretty embarrassing incidents in the back half of the 2010s involving Russian special operations soldiers that were allegedly on vacation, posting pictures of themselves in full military gear in Donetsk and Luhansk. Some of them were caught.
Maybe they were on vacation, man.
I don't know about you, but I've never experienced serving in the military and being told that I could take all of my weapons on vacation with me to another country.
Oh, really?
They like to LARP.
Weapons, too.
Yeah, but and then the other thing here too is like they were caught doing this on Tinder and stuff like that. And there were incidents like the shoot down of the MH317 flight, the Dutch aircraft, where it was done using a surface-to-air missile launcher that the rebels in Donetsk and Luhansk definitely would not have had access to based on what was sitting in that area at the time they took it over, which was pretty blatantly carted across the border from Russia, set up there. They thought they were shooting down a military transport plane, and then they moved the system right back into Russia after using it. And this isn't conjecture on my part. They were able to track down the exact people that did it. A lot of them have ICC cases against them, and one of them, Igor Girkin, who was formerly high up in the FSB and was also deeply involved in setting up the Donetsk People's Republic, is actually currently sitting in Russian prison for criticizing Putin a little bit too much. So,
well, tit for tat, that happens in every country. Just hate to tell you that. But it seems like, even like I don't disagree with anything that you just said. Is it within the realm of believability for human beings to want to exert power over smaller entities? Of course. It's the nature of who we are. We're terrible, violent, greedy shitheads. But I always prioritize it over who's the worst offender. And I still will contend that the United States is the worst by far, with more done and leading to more chaos and more deaths and more resource expropriation than Russia. And even if that's because of Russia's own incompetence, I mean, it's only a country of about 150 million people. America's 350 million. Whatever the reason or whatever the circumstances is why Russia can't imperialize just as good as the United States, I really have to just point out that the United States has the most aggressive, most egregious, backwards foreign policy.
We got the most bodies for sure.
With bodies stacked really high, and dictator governments that we've installed that tortured people, like we discussed last week. It's no question that Russia, given the same opportunity, would come out and start doing the same thing that the United States have done. I mean, there's already talk of them moving into places like Mali, or that the Wagner Group has been spotted somewhere in Africa.
Oh, blah, blah, I'm blah. So glad you mentioned that, because that was the other thing I wanted to talk about. So first of all, Wagner Group is actually no longer called Wagner. They
the artist formerly known as Wagner.
They are now known as Afrika Korps, because if the previous allusions to Nazi stuff was too subtle for you, now we've just renamed it after what the German Expeditionary Force to Africa was called.
Yeah. Well, dude, I gotta say, like, the military, no matter what military you're in, has fascistic tendencies. The only one that didn't was like the guerrillas that Che led in Cuba.
Yeah, but communist militias.
They're the ones we're all equal, and if you don't like it, we're gonna kill you. Like the rest of them are it's us versus them. It's a tribalistic sort of mentality, and Nazism is nothing but tribalism based on race.
I just think the irony of Wagner being renamed to that is particularly funny, given Russia's stated political reasons for intervening more. Russia casts itself as specifically. But that's the thing, we're going to sit here and argue till the cats come home about who's more Nazi, which side or the other. Yeah. I just read today that you're in Ukraine when the Maidan protests kicked off. Only 8 to 20% of the protesters that were in there were fucking neo-Nazis. But the thing was, they were the most effective. They were the ones that secured government buildings. They were the ones that were able to use violence to justify the means and stuff. So they're there too. They're everywhere. I would say, though, that it's the nature of conflict that people that are nationalists are going to also be the ones frequently that are most aggressively supportive of defending their own country's sovereignty. They're the ones that are going to be most upset about foreign intervention.
We agree with
and
that.
Meddling and stuff like that. So it's not that obviously the idea of opposing these things or the protests was inherently a Nazi ideal. It was more that this is the sort of cause that nationalists, as per their ideology, will be the ones that you will see line up for first. And
I agree with that 100%.
And I've also met plenty of anarchists and socialists in Ukraine that are fighting on the front lines and very much opposed to Russia as well. So I would say that war is one of the few times, an existential war for your country's future is one of the few times where you will see everyone on the political spectrum put aside their differences and cooperate. Yeah. Because you all have the same end goal of, I don't want this other country to flatten us, and we can work out our differences after we've dealt with this much bigger problem.
And the thing is, you and I and everybody in this room agree that the sovereignty of Ukraine, it should be respected. And the invasion was an egregious act. It was not the nicest, most ethical thing that you could do. But what we're contending is it could have been avoided, or at the very least could come to an end in the near future. And I did want to talk about this because, China recently came out with their own 12-point plan. And I'm sure you know about this, Matt, where they said, hey, let's have a little peace in Ukraine. They gave a document to Russia, everybody, Ukraine. They said, here, I got 12 points. And I'll read off the 12 points. It's respecting the sovereignty of all countries. Boom. You automatically save your border. Everybody goes back to normal borders. Everybody's, this is what China is proposing. Abandoning the Cold War mentality. 2, 3, ceasing hostilities. 4, resuming peace talks. 5, resolving the humanitarian crisis. 6, protecting the civilians and prisoners of war. 7, keeping the nuclear power plants safe. 8, reducing strategic risks. 9, facilitating grain exports. 10, stopping unilateral sanctions. Now, that's going to be a big concession on the West's part. Keeping industrial supply chains stable. And the last one is promoting post-conflict reconstruction. Now, what's wrong with that, Matt?
So I can think of one major thing that is going to torpedo that entire one.
I mean, it's a peace document.
Yes, it is. And honestly, if we could work out some sort of peace deal along those exact lines where Ukraine's internationally recognized territorial integrity is fully restored, I would be very open to that. There's one problem, though. Ukraine and Russia inherently disagree on whose territory is whose at this stage, because as part of their invasion, they held referendums in Donetsk, in the occupied areas of Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia oblasts. Obviously, these referendums were about as reasonable and believable in terms of how the people there actually felt as, a lot of questionable things that happened. But the issue is that according to Russian law, those 4 oblasts in their entirety are integral parts of Russia. And also under Russian law, it is actually a crime to suggest otherwise. So Russia has backed itself into a corner now that they cannot stop this war, not only along current borders, but they can't stop this war until they succeed in seizing control of all of those 4 oblasts. And they only have about half of each one. Large portions of Donetsk Oblast, Luhansk Oblast, Kherson Oblast, and Zaporizhia Oblast are still controlled by Ukrainian forces. And likewise,
according to Al Jazeera, they said that they're interpreting this thing to say this likely means upholding the territorial integrity of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders prior to the 2014 Russian annex of Crimea.
Yeah, and
which is a pretty sweet deal.
You don't think Russia would ever go for that?
I don't think they would, because ultimately Putin is an authoritarian. And the issue is,
why not call his bluff and say, okay, we'll sign the Chinese peace plan if it does definitely means that we're call his bluff instead of saying,
oh, well, that'll never,
what that makes no sense.
I mean, I don't know if I actually was not informed about this yet. I don't know if Ukraine has formally rejected it yet.
Well, here's the deal. There was a
jump
peace.
In real quick.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Chris.
Well, there was a peace conference that the West set up. The United States had one in Switzerland, and they invited Ukraine and stuff, and it was supposed to be for peace talks. But the thing is, they didn't invite Russia. What's with that?
I believe that Russia actually refused to attend. And there have been actually several other peace talks where Russia actually refused to attend that based on the fact that it was held in Switzerland. And they claimed that Switzerland was not neutral because it had sent humanitarian aid to Ukraine. Even though Switzerland has not only refused to sell weapons to Ukraine, they have actually refused to allow countries that have purchased Swiss weapons or weapons with Swiss components to transfer them to Ukraine under their licensing deals. I know that there have been some news articles that Putin has signaled his willingness to a ceasefire along current lines, but that's not actually a peace agreement, and it doesn't meaningfully change anything. It just delays the conflict.
Well, to be fair, it says not only did we not invite him, but he also refused. So there you go. Yeah. I guess it's tit for tat. But in the same way, China's got a plan. Russia's aligned with China. Call their bluff. if you really want peace and you want those borders back, you can even have the Crimean Peninsula. Then China happens to be on your side.
Yeah, no, I think that if a deal like that, I would say Ukraine should absolutely accept a deal like that. It's by far, realistically, a peace deal where Ukraine's entire territorial integrity is restored, and there are specific binding clauses in treaties that will compel countries to defend Ukraine should it be invaded again. That would be a good end result for me. I'd be very happy with that. It's better than a military solution at this stage, because the reality is that even if it is doable to force Russia out of all the territory they've occupied, it will take years, and it will be an extremely bloody, grueling campaign. It's not going to be easy. So if there was a diplomatic solution that would get Ukraine everything it really wants in terms of territorial integrity and peace, I would absolutely support that.
All right, there you go.
Mike? Can I just say, right off the bat, it's one of my biggest pet peeves when Americans who pay attention to politics, and I'm not saying this is what you were doing, Matt, don't take this the wrong way. When Americans who pay attention to politics by reading headlines say that they know what's going on in Putin's brain. I think that's one of the funniest and just the most adorable things that I see Americans do when they analyze politics through the sphere of Putin's a madman and he just woke up one day and decided to invade Ukraine because he's crazy. I'm not saying that's what you're doing. I always think that this stuff, because I don't subscribe to the great man theory of history or current events. I just don't think that's the case. I think it's about economic incentives and material benefits and things like that. But I say that because I also think that I was under the impression until you just said this, Matt, that Putin would have stopped doing the invasion or agreed to a peace deal if it meant that there was going to be an agreement of no NATO membership for Ukraine or further expansion of NATO on the borders that he was so worried about, that he was originally saying were the justifications for the invasion to begin with. So now that's not the case. That is news to me. But again, I don't claim to know what's inside Putin's head because I don't think about politics that way. It seems weird to me that people do.
I think you should just try, right? You should just try to get out of Western influence and see how it develops. We'll all find out what happens if they start genociding people and taking over people. Pull out Western forces, let Ukraine do what Ukraine is going to do. Don't offer them NATO membership. Come to it. But if Russia keeps coming in, influence, and so then go to war. But at the same time,
there are the first actual deployment of any troops from a NATO country is France, and they're only sending instructors so far. Currently, there are not NATO soldiers. Russia is not fighting NATO in Ukraine. Right? Russia is fighting Ukrainian soldiers, foreigners that volunteered to come to Ukraine and enlisted in the Ukrainian army on the same contracts that any Ukrainian soldier has. Look, I wish I got mercenary pay.
Any CIA troops?
They won't tell you.
We got some screenshots from 2015.
Well, we can go back and forth on that. But ultimately, this war is being fought by Ukrainians and volunteers who are functionally, there's not that many of them. It's not a deciding factor in the number of people here. And most of the weapons that have been sent are expired cast-offs from NATO. It's not the new top-end stuff. A really good example of this is every single M72 law, which is a disposable rocket launcher I've seen in this country, has actually been expired. And they were all stamped with basically expired, not for use inside the United States or for training.
That's it says the same thing on the food that they're dropping in Palestine.
All right.
Expired only for circus animals and convicts.
Yeah, it's the same deal with a lot of the javelins that are here. They're past their use by date. Stinger missiles past their use by date. They're built beyond contract standards, so they actually all still work great. But the key is, it's not like Ukraine is the latest and greatest from NATO fighting the war for them. They're doing it themselves.
And it's crazy because I keep seeing the U.S. approving packages. They just approved another couple billion to Azov directly, which for the last 6 months, every Ukraine apologist was telling me was barely even a regiment anymore. Everybody was like, "Oh, Azov barely even is this." They're a couple thousand people. Don't even worry about those neo-Nazis. Now they're back and they're getting billions of dollars from the U.S. again.
Here's the other. Okay, go ahead.
So the Azov that exists today is not the Azov that existed in 2018 when it was folded into the National Guard. It's different people because most of, unfortunately, a high percentage of the original Azov fighters are dead. And at this stage, it is
womp womp. Sorry.
It is just a highly trained National Guard unit like any other. Like it's nothing special. But yes, there are aid packages and weapons and stuff like that. But the key is that these weapons, a lot of the initial packages especially, was stuff left over from the 80s that can't be used anymore in the U.S. legally even. No. I completely lost my train of thought there.
Sorry about that. And you lost it. I'm taking over. Yeah. And Ukraine has a significant problems with weapons going on the black market. Prior to the invasion in 2020, Ukraine had already had a large black market for firearms with 3.6 million illegal weapons compared to only 890,000 registered guns. This was kind of due to the collapse of the Soviet Union, but now you have us sending guns over there. And according to Russian officials, take it with a grain of salt, 20% of the weapons sent by the West to Ukraine end up on the black market within 2 weeks. Now, I know Putin's a madman and all Russians are liars, but at some point, the broken clock is even right, probably.
Yeah, I don't buy that at all, just based on how stringent the commanders and armories are here with accounting for things. You will get yelled at if you lose a magazine in combat.
Well, didn't they hand out a lot of weapons to civilians?
That was
like over 1 million rifles.
Yeah, they handed out a lot to. They handed out a lot of rifles to people in Kiev, but the key here and to other places. But the key here is they took down people's IDs and stuff like that when they did it. And after the first month or so of the war, once the front stabilized, there was a massive campaign to go around and round up all those rifles, and that didn't really make the news.
According to my sources, it says that many are now outside this direct state control and are at risk of being trafficked. So
yeah, and
Russian propaganda, Chris.
I know, it's my problem.
There's a lot of it is Russian propaganda. Look, I'll freely admit that there is a problem with uncontrolled weapons floating around Ukraine. What I will also say is that any country that is in a state of total war, where you have this many people with weapons, stuff is just going to start showing up. For example,
that goes without saying.
It is, of course, in Russia's best interest to exaggerate that. Just like it's in their best interest to exaggerate when there are neo-Nazis in any of the various militias in Ukraine and then say that they are denazifying Ukraine. But also, it would really be in the West and Ukraine's best interest if they made more of an effort of getting rid of those neo-Nazis, because then Russia wouldn't be able to say that. It would be a lot easier if those guys weren't showing up with their totem cop passages on the New York Times all the time.
Come on, Mike. You're not going to get rid of those neo-Nazis. They're the ones who do all the violence.
That also is true, and that's why I'm more than willing to admit that they are present in Wagner Group and Rusich and other Russian militias. It's not that I support Nazis. It's just like I say that it would be better for the U.S. to take a backseat on the world stage, even if Russia and China fill that power vacuum, simply because they are less competent. And that's literally the divide and conquer strategy for the world working class, is to be able to get rid of the global hegemon and then start tackling the smaller ones after that. That's basic anti-imperialism 101.
I mean, in theory, yes, but in practice, the way Russia treats occupied areas. And once again, I hate comparing two people doing bad things because they're both bad and we shouldn't want either of them to happen. But the way Russia treats occupied areas and the people that live there.
This is actually historically true in the sense of Europe and things like that. That's true. But America on sheer
America is more capable on sheer amount of causing human suffering, but when Russia actually manages to occupy an area,
they don't do a great job treating them good. Yeah, I get that.
So I served with some people that actually fought in Bucha and Irpin, and what they told me about what they found was they found Connex boxes full of civilians that had been executed with their hands bound. There was one house they went into where there was a pair of bloody nails on the table, where apparently a woman had had her hands nailed to the table.
Dude, you don't have to describe this stuff. I mean, honestly, everybody's this is
like a live stream genocide going on right now, in addition to the other 4 that are not getting live streamed that the U.S. is complicit in.
I could tell you about people got their genitals hooked up together, their fingernails ripped out, eyeballs paper cut, everything that you can imagine you can do to a human body. We've seen it all. I mean, and nobody's special. We don't need to sit here and go apples to oranges, because at the end of the day,
What I will say about this is that while the United States military has done lots of horrific things, UCMJ is very, very clear on what soldiers are and are not allowed to do to the people of the country the United States is occupying. And when soldiers are caught engaging in this kind of behavior, it is broadly condemned by the public. And
then they get pardoned by Trump.
Yeah.
Who I strongly dislike. But my point is,
they'll get pardoned by someone else. Like, I don't think that Biden's pardoning anybody, but like, they also just don't usually get held accountable.
These people generally do not. People that get caught committing horrific war crimes against civilians and are actually convicted generally do not get presidential pardons. They generally rot in Fort Leavenworth for a very long time. But in Russian military culture, this is accepted. They take pride in it, and it is encouraged on a systemic level. It's not that there's like an investigation and some war crimes turn up. We know about a lot of the horrific things Russians do to POWs or civilians in occupied areas because they take videos of it and post it on Telegram.
Does Russia have a Hague Invasion Act similar to the U.S.?
I don't believe so. That I know exactly what you're talking about, and every time
that's pretty damning.
Yeah, no.
Okay,
I'm not going to defend that shit.
Look, I don't think if you say, but saying that the U.S. Never pardoned war criminals is not true. That's actually
no. They have been absolutely pardoned, but it's not. Trump is one of my least favorite people right now in general for several reasons. I don't like his policies. I don't like Project 2025, and I don't like the people that support him. I think that his vision for the future of America is incredibly grim, and I generally do not like anything he stands for.
Do you think that there's a huge difference between him and the other guy?
I think there's enough of a difference that...
In what ways?
Well, let me put it this way. I think you have a really good argument for if you're like an actual accelerationist, like you've been flirting with like the ideology of Poseidism, and you're like...
That's my least favorite thing that I want to hear. Accelerationism.
It's the funniest one. Like,
no, de-accelerationism. Yeah. Please.
Yeah, I'll say this. I think Biden is pretty bad, but
thank God.
People hyper-focus on how bad the guy that's currently in is, and not on how much worse things can get. It's really difficult just because I don't like the Trump alarmism where like I think he's going to take over and institute the Fourth Reich in America. I'm not going to claim he's going to do that.
No.
But at the same time, in terms of like it is shocking just how much worse he can make things. And I think the key part of his policy that concerns me in Project 2025 is not his individual policy points. I'm not super worried about like the individual bad things he says he's going to do.
Yeah.
What I'm more concerned about is his desire to systemically change the United States government in ways that will make ever affecting change the other way again much harder.
Sure.
Specifically, the stuff there's a lot of conversation that I've been seeing in like the conservative media right now in the U.S. about how being able to vote in presidential elections is not a constitutional right. And they are technically correct, but they're arguing for essentially like civics test to vote, which sounds to me suspiciously like literacy test with the serial numbers filed off. But essentially they're talking about doing all these things that in the short term don't seem as bad as like, say, Jared Kushner's ideal of selling off beachfront property in Gaza, but in the long term will further push the United States down a path where the course cannot be corrected as easily. And a really good example is the desire to completely stack the courts, right? Because election cycles are 2 to 6 years, depending on what the position is. Court appointments are for life. And if you appoint a bunch of hard right-wing authoritarians who are relatively young to these positions, you will have a court system that will make it incredibly difficult to affect substantial legal change in the United States for decades. It's the same deal with stripping down access to voting and voting rights. It might not be as in your face as, say, going after the LGBTQ community legally, but by changing the way voting works to specifically favor one group of people, you eliminate the ability of everyone else to attempt to course correct in future elections because they will have less ability to just vote, or the districts will be drawn in such a way that their vote won't matter. So that is what scares me about Trump. It's not that like his individual policies will be disastrous, although I believe they will. It's that him having another term could potentially restructure the American government in such a way that would make improving things very difficult, if not functionally impossible, potentially for decades.
Yeah, so we see that. Look, you're talking to a bunch of leftists here. We know what's at stake. We don't like Orange Guy, but we also don't like the Mummy or whatever, this decrepit old like wax museum fucking guy. But, you know, ultimately, at the end of the day, they're both funded by BlackRock. They're funded by the same huge institutions. A lot of the foreign policy ends up the same. I think you're right in the sense that he's going to reverse things. Maybe he'll reverse term limits, stuff like this, these permanent changes that trickle down and end up tearing apart democracy for more of a long-term thing, which I don't really care. I hope that America does fall apart. But the other thing is invoking and activating his base to go out and do stuff and like commit hate crimes and stuff. That is one of the most frightening parts for me, is how stupid and ready for violence and ignorant that this whole cross-section of the population is. But at the same time, people don't have a lot of options, and God, he'll be at least entertaining as he burns everything to the ground, won't he?
I mean, I don't know.
Some whoppers. You got one guy who's looking for a chair constantly, and then you got this other guy who's constantly, you know.
I was going to ask Chris if you want to do some trying to do some like wrap up final thoughts, because so
next
Biden
week
versus Trump, can I just say it's like a wash? Like there's literally no difference as far as like really impact on the world stage. It's like Biden may feel a little better domestically, whereas Trump feels more grating and abrasive to people here at home because he really makes that fascism apparent. But my point of view is the U.S. is already the Fourth Reich and always has been. And that's evidenced by the 900 military bases that it uses to extract imperial super profits. And when Biden gets in office, like most white liberals are content to ignore that fascism. They have stopped talking about the ICE concentration camps, just like us communists predicted would happen once Biden got in office. They're content to ignore the fascism as long as they can like go to brunch. Then I think that's going to be evidence. Like if Trump gets back in office, like what's that?
As long as you put rainbow flags on everything, you can go and bomb as many brown people as you want.
No,
if Trump gets back in again, we're probably likely going to see some more BLM level protests nationwide, like we saw before. But like even now, like conservatives think it's a conspiracy that like mass shootings are not making news like they were under Trump. But like that's just liberal media, like with the liberal bias. Like they'll report on them, but it's not going to make the national news that like gun control advocacy groups would push it to make under a Republican president, because that's their agenda. And it's not like a conspiracy or anything. It's just like the agendas and the profit that are at work. So it's like the same way that like all this stuff rubs me the white nationalist racist way when people think that they somehow know what is in Putin's mind. But then if you ask that same person, do they think that the average Russian person knows what's in Biden's mind or Trump's mind? It's like Biden and Trump are just as much regime dictators for me as Putin or Xi Jinping or anybody else is, because they just have the actual power to enact their will upon the rest of the world that I guess people think Putin would do if he had the ability. And it's like, I don't understand how people can look at the things that they already know about, like the NSA and its grip on the internet, the 11 Eyes Alliance that used to be the 5 Eyes, then the 9 Eyes, and is now the 11 Eyes Alliance that is spying on all of us and controlling the internet. How do they look at that and still think like the Great Firewall of China or Russian propaganda is the biggest force for like driving internet disinformation? It's like, it doesn't make sense to me. Like it goes right along with the Russian incompetence angle. Like you can't have both be true.
And say what you want about Trump. I wanted to add this. Dude went over and shook hands with Kim Jong-un. He didn't rattle any sabers. He just went over there.
Like that. That's like probably one of the better things he did.
That was funny as hell.
I mean, I personally thought that Trump's behavior, where he was saluting North Korean generals and generally talking very friendly about how he liked a lot of what Kim Jong-un had done, and he'd like to maybe see about implementing some of that in America, was more concerning for me than anything else. I mean, personally, I'm not a huge fan of North Korean policy as a whole, but
I am.
But you would get health care at least if he comes back. He says, "Okay, listen, everybody, we're gonna
defect, dude."
Everybody in America has to put a picture of Trump in their house and worship it twice a day. But for it, you get dental care and health care. I'm like, okay, fine.
I want to throw this out here. I know we're a little over time, but as a medical professional that is currently actually studying to attain a higher level of medical competency, I just want to point out that there is actually serious problems with Russian medicine. Remember when I mentioned the whole issue with Russification and the idea of keeping everyone in the Russian language sphere, which means Russian culture sphere? Well, what that also means is the Russian medical sphere. So if you go to a doctor in most Western countries, or even large parts of Asia, a lot of them will speak English reasonably well. And most good global medical research, at least the papers themselves, are at minimum published in English as well as the original language of the people that write them. Well, Russian doctors, and to a lesser but still problematic extent Ukrainian doctors, often do not speak English. And because of this, they're limited to medical research that takes place in Russia, Ukraine, and some other Russian-speaking countries. And what this actually is translated into is, when I first got to Ukraine, there were things about medicine that were 20 or 30 years behind the acceptable medical standard in the West.
Lift the sanctions.
Well,
lift the sanctions.
It's not about, I'm not talking about in terms of access to medications or medical devices.
Get rid of proprietary information. Make information free.
So all of these medical journals are either fairly cheap to access, but the papers themselves are often free if you write the people that wrote them. Like all of the study I'm about to cite has been publicly available for anyone to read since 2002. So, small medical aside, but basically, when someone sustains a traumatic brain injury, there's a chance that they can start experiencing swelling of the brain. And if this is left untreated, it can be fatal.
Sure.
Now, prior to the early 2000s, there were some people that thought that giving a corticosteroid called dexamethasone could counteract this and lead to better patient outcomes for people with TBIs. That being said, in 2002, there was a very large study on trauma patients conducted called CRASH-1 that emphatically showed that not only does dexamethasone not improve patient outcomes with TBI patients, it actually increases mortality.
Oof.
Wow.
So this has been something that has been known and an established part of medical protocol in the United States and Western and Central Europe for 20 years at this point. Like we know, you do not give dexamethasone to TBI patients.
Interesting.
Even last spring in Ukraine last year, there were still medics that were doing this, and I would get into arguments sometimes with other medics about giving patients dexamethasone. I'd hand off a TBI patient to the hospital and I'd say, do not give him dexamethasone. And they're like, it's in the protocol. It's like, the protocol is wrong. And the reason that this knowledge doesn't filter in is because these people were for so long trapped inside that specific Russian language sphere that they were not able to benefit from the rest of this publicly available information.
Yeah. And then the thing is, it's also a matter of, bridging the gap, lending the olive branch of peace to your fellow brothers and sisters, human beings, and saying, because capitalism is about competition. It's about trying to get one over on the next guy. It's about getting one over on the other country, not letting them get too. So at no point do we do that. Do we extend that thing and say, hey, looks like you're having trouble with TBIs. Here, do this, do that. We'll translate the papers for you. We can't do that as people. And so this is why capitalism, this inherently always competitive force, only exacerbates this issue to where one country is living in the Stone Age and we're over here living it up in modernity with our antibiotics and stuff like that. Fancy antibiotics. Look, we're way over time. I just wanted to say, we must do this again because we didn't even get to the meat of it. There's so much to talk about. Maybe you guys want to do it next week? What do you say? We'll see. You might be gone.
Like to. I'm just thinking I might be headed out next Tuesday, and I don't think the remote areas of certain parts of the Eastern Front are going to be super conducive to reporting anything.
We wouldn't want to give up your location either.
Yeah, no, I don't like talking about where I'm going just because social media is actually a major thing that's used for targeting. When I talk about open source intelligence, that's actually a part of it. And I have known of people getting killed because of it. So
we all remember the Reddit incident.
Oh god,
early on in the Ukraine invasion.
I'm thinking more of the Brazilian TikTok incident from Yavarov.
What happened?
Brazilians were posting their location on TikTok. The Yavarov base got blown up. It was really bad.
Yeah.
Wow.
All right. Well, thank you, Matt, for doing this. I appreciate it. This was like a lot less spicy than last time, but it was still very entertaining and fun. And thank you for everything you brought. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Because I had to defer to you in a lot of topics where I think, well, okay, tell me something. Tell me something new. I've never heard. This sounds new. Okay. I like that.
Yeah, I'm not going to say that you don't know what you're talking about, Matt.
But I
did literally used to write about this for a living, so.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell. Look, obviously, we're still going to disagree. We think capitalism is the greatest evil. We think America is the greatest evil. We want to see it. We want to see it ended. We want to see it overhauled in so many different ways. We'll get to it later. Look, I didn't even get to the IMF and the World Bank debt trapping places like Ukraine and Argentina and all these other countries, and then instituting neoliberal policies that enforce them for austerity, deregulation, and privatization. But you know what? We'll get to that the next time.
Matt, even if we don't agree with you, best of luck if you're being sent back to the front. Like, I hope you stay healthy and happy, and only help the Ukrainians that don't have the Nazi tattoos. If you do me a favor.
Hey, look, as a medic, I'm going to help. Anyone on my side, and after I've helped them, if there are Russians that are injured too, I'm legally obligated under the Geneva Convention to render aid to them as well.
Legally, wow. I was going to say, for me, just help the animals. I don't really care about the people. Just a joke, though. Just a joke. Wish you well,
I got to
Matt.
pick up my kids. Thank you, guys.
Take care of yourself. See you soon. All right. So what? You going to pick up the kids?
Yeah, I got to pick them up, but then I'll be back at 3:20. But you want to do the next one at 4, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. School's nearby. Okay, great. Yeah. Come back in an hour. We're going to do it again.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, man.
Cool, bro. Later.